Okay, today we're going to talk about how to operate a pump and the best operation for making a pump work. But before we do that, we're going to have a little fluid mechanics lesson. And when you drink, most people think that when you drink a liquid out of a straw, that you're pulling the water up to your mouth. That is inaccurate. That is not what is happening. What is happening is when you drink liquid through a straw, you're making the air in this tube evacuate. You're creating a vacuum in this tube here. And if you look at this little diagram here, it has three examples. It shows this little column here where there is nobody trying to, there's no vacuum. Nobody's trying to suck on the end of it, basically, if you want to think of it that way. So the water's down at this level. Okay, the next tube here is if we've put a perfect vacuum on it, which basically means we've taken all the air out of the tube. And what happens is that allows the water to rise. That the atmospheric pressure is no longer being applied to the surface of the water, so the water will rise up the tube. This third diagram, third column, is the theoretically how much of a vacuum you can pull using a ordinary trash pump. And it says right here, it says partial vacuum 25 feet. So in other words, if you put a tube down in the water and it was 25 feet tall or 30 feet tall and you took all the air out of that tube, the water would rise up 25 feet, and that's all the further it would rise. And if anyone has ever tried to suck water out of a hose at home, their garden hose, standing up and the water being below the ground or down at ground level, you recognize that you can't pull hard enough to get that water to rise. So I'm just going to demonstrate here real quick. You'll notice that there's holes in the bottom of this tube. I'm going to place these down in the water. And you'll notice just what you figured. I was able to pull that water straight up through into my mouth because I was able to create a vacuum inside this tube. Now, however, if I turn this over, you'll notice that this has got holes in the tube. If I put that end that doesn't have the holes down in the water and try to suck the water up to my mouth or create a vacuum in this tube, I'm not able to do it because I cannot evacuate all the air in this tube if there's holes in this tube here. So that's your fluid dynamics lesson. Now let's go look at the pumps. Okay, so we talked about the straw and we demonstrated a little bit of fluid mechanics involved here. Now we're going to talk about the pump. This is our typical pump here at the shop. It's a Honda WD20X 2-inch pump, also called a trash pump. It's a centrifugal design. When would you want to use a trash pump? Let's talk about that. Well, a trash pump is designed to pull out lots and lots of water. So if I look at this suction hose here, and I look at the end of it, you'll notice there's lots and lots of holes in the end of this suction hose. And that strainer there. Okay, so if I don't have lots and lots of water, like this would be a good application here because there's lots and lots of water. If I had a shallow pool that wasn't gonna, I wasn't gonna get a substantial supply of water in this strainer, I would want to use the 2-inch whacker pump in the shop. It's an electric and it sits right down in the water, and that's a perfect application for that. But a trash pump, if you got lots of water, it's the ideal tool for the job. Okay, before we operate the pump, we're going to want to make sure that it's good to operate. So let's go through our normal check that we would do before we operate the trash pump. We're going to check the gas. Make sure we got plenty of gas. It's unleaded gas. It is not pre-mixed gas. That's important to note. just regular straight unleaded. We're going to check the oil. This oil's got a dipstick on it. Basically what you do is you wipe off your dipstick, and we're going to put it back in there. We're going to look for it to be at least halfway up on the dipstick. You can see that the oil is about halfway up. That's fine. Put her back in. If not, you'd want to add a little bit of oil. Probably SAE 10W30 or 30 weight oil would be fine. The last thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check the air filter. Pull this off here. Pull this guy off. You're going to be looking for any dirt or dust in this area here. If there is, you're going to want to get that cleaned off good. That typically means if there's dust that you don't have a good seat here. That's important. That's why it's important to check, because if it draws dust and dirt into the engine, you'll end up tearing up the engine. So it's always a good idea to check the air filter and get it screwed down good and seated. And that should be all you really need to do to check out the pre-operation on the trash pump. Okay, now we've talked about the pre-operation. Let's talk about how you actually hook a trash pump up. You got two pieces. You got a suction hose like this. Normally has a metal strainer on the end of it. You're going to want to toss this out into the water, or put it in the water in an area that doesn't have a bunch of mud and muck. You're going to want to make sure you got good access to water, like we talked about earlier. So I'm going to do my best here to get this one out there. Not perfect, but I think it'll work where it's at. You're going to check your hose. You're going to check the gasket on your hose here, this little rubber guy right in here. If it's all kind of boogered up, probably need a new one, because that's an important element in getting a good seal on the suction hose. You're going to want to inspect your suction hose. If you see something on your hose that looks like this, that's not good, because that more than likely means that somebody has found a hole in the hose and has tried to mitigate the problem. But I can tell you that ain't gonna fly, because again, on the suction hose, this piece right here on your pump is the intake. This is like your mouth on the hose, and again, you're trying to create a vacuum in this hose here, and air is your enemy. Air down there at the strainer, air anywhere in the line, any holes in the line, not a good seal up here. If there's any air getting in, you're not going to draw suction, and 9 times out of 10, that's going to be the failure in being able to pump the water. You'll notice that we've got the pump set up here on this manhole. I'm doing that to sort of simulate the conditions that you would normally find on a job. Actually, if I were actually doing this job here, I would want to get this pump down as close as I can to the water. Because again, like that straw we were talking about and sucking up, trying to evacuate air like a water hose at your house, even standing 5 foot up in the air, the higher it is, the harder it is to get that air out of the line. And your pump is made to do 2 things. It's made to pull the line, pull a vacuum in that hose, and to spit the water out. The typical trash pump like this is rated for what they call a head of 135 feet. You can only have 26 feet from the intake to the water, and then you can only have a maximum of whatever 135 minus 26 is on the discharge. That's the total head. If you want water to evacuate as quickly as possible, you want to have this guy here as close to the water as you can. And you want to have this discharge hose. Like if you have a choice between going over the top of a hill and going around the hill, I would suggest going around the hill. It also makes a difference on how much hose you have. The more hose you have on the discharge or the intake, the harder the pump's got to work, the less water you're going to get out the end of the hose. So keep those things in mind when setting it up. So we've checked on this one here, we've checked where we've got it located. We've checked the hose. Doesn't appear to be any obvious places where air can get in. So now you want to come over here, put it into if you'll help me out here, George. This part right here, you want to have both of these locked in. You sort of do it a little bit at a time. It takes a little bit of oomph. So this is another example that if you don't have this area right here locked in good, there's a possibility air is going to get in and not allow you to create that vacuum in this hose. Okay, the discharge hose, we'll take this off for a second. This has got the same sort of gasket right here. If it's boogered up, you're going to want to replace it. The discharge side, which typically a discharge is the higher of the two, you'll notice. This gasket's not as important because it's not trying to create a vacuum in this line. It's just pushing the water at this point. So really what you're doing there is you're keeping water from coming out here at the pump. Same thing applies here. Get them both locked in there. Last thing you're going to want to do before you start turning it on is we're going to want to prime the pump. And a lot of people want to know, well, what's priming the pump? Well, again, if you look at this area right here that we're considering where your mouth would go on the straw, and I tried to suck on this tube here, if I didn't have any water down in here, it's going to draw air from this guy right here. And just like the straw example, there's no way you can pull a vacuum if you're pulling in air. So really what the water's doing is isolating this pump, this centrifugal pump, from this access to air. And it's allowing this pump to start generating this vacuum on this suction hose, which is going to allow the water to rise. So we're going to want to make sure we fill this whole thing up to the top with water. And you'll note looks like we got plenty of water in there. Put this back on, making sure you don't strip the threads because they're plastic and they will strip. And that will also keep you from drawing a good vacuum. It'll allow you to get air in here. Okay, now we've talked about the setup of the pump. We've got it all. We've got the discharge set up. We've got the intake set up, the suction. We've got the pump primed. We've made sure that it's got plenty of fuel and oil and the air filter's good. Now we're ready to start it up. Over here on the right hand side, you'll notice there's an on-off button. You want to have that placed in the on position. You have a throttle here. All the way to the right is low throttle. All the way to the left is full throttle. For starting it up, I'll probably put it midway. You have a choke that is typically all the way to the left is on. That's typically on when you first try to start the engine. Later on in the day, normally you don't have to use the choke, but first part of the day you normally have to. So left is on. When I get that started, I'll move it to the right, turn it off. This is the fuel. To the left is off, to the right is on. So this is basically the position that the switches are in when you first try to start the engine. So I'm going to try to fire this guy up. Now it could be that I started it earlier, so I might make sense to turn the choke off here so I don't flood it, and try this again. Okay, normally I'll put a 3/4 throttle probably. Issue is never the throttle, almost never. So playing with the governor or doing any of this stuff, you're just wasting your time. Because again, the issue, if you're having trouble pumping, the issue is almost always air in the line somewhere on the suction. So a lot of guys, you'll see them put their hand up here and do this to the discharge hose. Really all you're doing there is keeping the water in your prime from flushing out your discharge. You're just keeping a good prime on your pump. That's really all you're doing there. It takes a little while. Okay, here it starts to come. But you'll notice, okay, it takes 3 or 4 minutes before it actually gets all that air out of the line. And so you just got to be a little patient. Now you'll notice that it's starting to pull. It pulled it up into the pump, and now at the other end, if you look down there, this messing with the throttle, doing all that stuff, that's usually has no bearing on the operation of the pump. When you get it going good, you can go ahead and idle her up, and then leave it until your job is done. Okay, one other thing I want to mention before I get into the actual dismantlement of the dismantling the pump here is if you're having trouble getting your hoses to work, maybe you're out there and you suspect you have a bad hose, but you don't know for sure, you don't see any duct tape, but all you know is it's not working good. My suggestion to you, even if you can't leave it there, get it as close to the water as you possibly can, get it started, get it pumping, and then drag the pump up to where you want it to go. And the reason why that'll work a lot of times is because if you get enough water into this hose, it'll mask some of the leaks you have in your suction hose and it'll allow you to get started, and then you can move it to where you're going to eventually put it. You're not going to be able to come back and get a new hose that at least allows you to get the job done. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dismantling the pump. You're done and you want to put it away. Down here on the bottom part of this pump is a drain line, and you want to drain that water out. And you want to make that a habit because in the winter time, you leave that in your truck and you leave that water in there, it'll bust this pump. So it's just a good idea to make it a habit and to do it every time. While that's draining, I'll take the suction and the discharge pump off. When putting this drain plug back in, again, it's a plastic thread. Be careful. Just make sure you get it, don't cross thread it. Make sure you get it threaded on there good again, because that can hold somebody up, because it'll draw air into this spot right here, and that's a hard one to diagnose. So we're going to have George is going to go down here to the discharge side on this discharge hose, and he's going to start rolling it up. Okay, you'll notice he's got it all rolled up, and you'll notice that the hose, the end that is sticking out is the side that's going to be plugged into the discharge. And this has an additional feature of it makes it nice and compact, and it also allows you when you can roll out the hose in a hurry and have this end get to where you want it to go. So this is rolled up good. You're going to want to put that in the back of your truck, and don't pile a bunch of stuff on it to put holes in it. Same goes with the suction hose. Even more critically, we sometimes get carried away with throwing stuff on top of it, but that suction hose is critical to your success. So he's going to roll that up. And before we leave the subject of the pump, I want to cover two other things, or a couple things to think about. If you suspect you have a bad hose, bring it back to the shop. We can test the hose, and we can also test the suction on your pump. So if you think you got a bad pump, bring it in and let us take a look at it, or a hose, and we can get you straightened out. That covers the operation of the 2-inch WD20X pump.